So welcome. This is our third evening, our third study session out of, I think, seven is how many we have. Uh, just a disclaimer again to start off. None of this material is mine. It's comes from things I've been studying over many years. Most of what we will talk about tonight is from William Lane Craig out of his book Reasonable Faith. And just for reference, uh, everything we talk about tonight is just I didn't count it, but it's less than 15 pages out of this book. So there's a lot of information packed in to this book. And if you're curious, if you want to know more about it, highly recommend this book, Reasonable Faith. The video that we're going to watch tonight, just like the one last week, was made by Dr. Craig and his staff at Reasonable Faith. So that's where all this information is coming from. The first evening we talked about what we answered the question, what is Christian apologetics? And it's really just the art and science of evangelism in a lot of ways. It's how do we communicate God's truth to folks that no matter what their worldview is, but how do we communicate that truth in a way that is with gentleness and respect, as 1 Peter 3:16 says, and then how do we just get ready to defend the reason for the hope that's within us? So that was the first night. We talked about what a worldview is. We did talk about motives a little bit. So why are we here? Really, like Bill said, it's about faith building for a lot of Christians. It's an encouragement. I know I'm encouraged every time I study a topic on apologetics. It's a good study for skeptics, so people who are skeptical of the validity and the truth behind the Christian faith. It's good to answer a lot of their questions if they're truly seeking the truth. What apologetics will not do is provide you with a silver bullet to tell your friends or your family or your coworkers that, look at this. Christianity is true because of this. Proof is subjective, so we talked about that. Proof is really just sufficient evidence. The sufficient piece of that is different for everybody. So that's why no matter what you tell some folks, they may never believe. So last week we talked about the moral argument. We talked a little bit about the history of it. The main takeaway there, I think, is the difference between the definitions of subjective and objective. You really got to understand what those words mean to understand the premises behind the moral argument. And what that means is, atheists can say that, hey, I'm good and I don't believe in God. I can be good without believing in God. And while that's true, it's subjective because that definition of good is just up to them at that point. They have no foundation to say that this is truly objectively good, or this is evil, or this is something we should do, or this is something we ought not to do. There's no foundation to base any sort of moral truth claim on unless there is without theism, basically. There's got to be, we showed that there had to be an objective source, an objective ultimate standard to show that things are good and things are bad and things are right and wrong, or there are moral duties and obligations. And we also learned that the basis of the Christian faith for what is good and evil is God's nature. The Bible is very clear that God is good and He's unchanging. And so that eliminates objections on the basis of Euthyphro's dilemma, which said, is God good because He tells us to do good things, or something good because God told us to do that? I think I may have messed that up. Is something good because God told us to do it, or does God tell us to do something because it is good. And what that is, if you pick one or the other, it's a false dilemma. So if you say that something is good because God commands it, that makes good arbitrary. It's just up to whatever whim that God may have. If you say that God commands something because it is good, then that's God has to appeal to a higher standard. And therefore, that doesn't fit the definition or the concept we have as God. So the answer to that question is neither. Neither one of those options are true. It's that God himself is good. He contains within himself, in his nature, the definition, the standard for what good is. So the more something conforms to his nature, the gooder it is, right? Farther away from that, the more evil it is. And so we went through a pretty thorough defense of the moral argument last week. This week is one of my favorites. It's called the teleological argument. And that means just having a purpose. So there's an argument from purpose for the existence of God. Some people call it the argument from design. Because if something has a purpose, there must have been a designer behind it. And then also, it's also called the fine-tuning argument, which is usually how I refer to it. The fine-tuning argument is the oldest and the most popular of all the arguments for the existence of God. And so we'll go over a little bit of history of that tonight, and then we'll watch the videos, a 6-minute video from Dr. Craig, and then we'll go through a defense of the premises. But some of the earliest well-written, well-documented accounts of this fine-tuning argument was actually from ancient Greece. In Plato's Academy, they taught extensively on astronomy. The reason they did that is because Plato said that there are two things that will lead men to believe in God. There's an argument from the soul, and there's an argument from science. And he believed that science was the key to, let me quote him here, awaken man to his divine destiny. That's from Plato. So the argument from science is that from the order of the motion of the stars and of all things under the dominion of the mind which ordered the universe. So he used both arguments to refute atheism, and he concluded that there's a best soul. So that's how you get to this idea of where does good come from, because he recognized the existence of objective moral values and duties, who is the maker and father of all, and he refers to him as the king. Aristotle, in his work called Metaphysics, he argued that there's a first unmoved mover. So an unmoved mover, he looked at the universe, he said, what put the universe into motion? Some force had to act upon it. But that force there has to be an initial cause for these events to take place. And there must be something that's unmoved to set that in motion. So if I push on this chair, my feet didn't, or it's not a chair, the podium, push on it, my feet didn't move. So there's got to be some basis from which to push things into existence, was his argument. Other translations call it a prime mover, and we still use that word in industry today. We use it in the power industry where I work, oil and gas. They use the concept prime mover quite a bit. It's ultimately the one machine that if it stops moving, it's the one that's supplying either motion or some form of energy to all the other processes in the plant. That comes from Aristotle. So from the earliest of times, men that were wholly removed from biblical revelation came to the conclusion that there must be a God and he must have these attributes that we just talked about, which line up with the attributes the Bible describes as this maximally great being having. And everyone calls that being God. That's what we mean by the word God. And so if we look in Romans chapter 1, verse 14 through 23, the Bible even talks about how folks that wholly removed from biblical revelation can look at the universe and see that God exists. He says, "For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth, since what can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and his divine nature." So we'll stop there. There's two things. An eternal power, referring to a creative act and the provision and sustaining that this eternal power does for the universe, is evident, but also his divine nature. So that's more about what we talked about last week around the moral argument. Both of those things, he says, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse, for though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became nonsense, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. That doesn't sound like today. I don't know what does, right? So even the reference at the end that they've exchanged the immortal God for images resembling man, birds, four-footed, to me that sounds like evolution, which is a lot of people's God. For the atheistic naturalist, so someone who believes there is no God, that nature is all there is, evolution is the driving force, and it's a blind, random machine. But that's the closest thing to a God that they can recognize, and they've exchanged the immortal God for these images resembling man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Obviously, this reference applies to idols of the time as well. So fast forwarding a little bit to Thomas Aquinas, 13th century. We talked about him last week and his 5 ways. Well, his 5th way is the teleological argument. And this is the way he put it, that all things operate towards some end, right? So there is some purpose, some end goal that all things move towards. So poppy seeds always become poppies, acorns become oaks. And they almost always succeed in whatever that purpose is. So how can something that's unconscious always hit the mark unless it's guided by something that has intelligence and consciousness and is conscious? The example he gives is the arrow does not tend towards the bullseye unless it is aimed by the archer. So what makes a poppy seed always turn into a poppy? So therefore, everything in nature must be directed towards its goal by someone with intelligence, and this we call God. So if you remember from last week, we had a quote from Richard Dawkins, and he claimed that objective moral values and duties do not exist. He's a evolutionary biologist, and he said DNA is all that there is. There's no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. 2 sentences ago that says there's no design or purpose. But here he's saying there's a reason for being. He says that DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So even he recognizes that we all move towards a purpose. So what the teleological argument does is say, what's the best explanation for this fine-tuning, for this purpose-driven universe that we see? Jesus in Matthew chapter 7 even referred to this this everything working towards some end. This isn't the point of the scripture, but the reference is there because it's just so obvious. He doesn't stop to explain it. He goes on to explain. He uses it as an example of bewaring of false prophets. So Matthew 7, verses 15 through 20, Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. You'll recognize them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? No, everybody knows that. In the same way, every good tree produces good fruit, but a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that doesn't produce good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire, so you'll recognize them by their fruit." My point here is that it's just so evident that we can use it in our everyday life as a reference point. So you can't deny that things work towards this end. William Paley wrote a book, Natural Theology, in 1804. And he gave an example of, let's say we're walking through the forest and we find a pocket watch laying on the ground. So we pick it up, you look at it, you see it's got a glass face. You got brass, you take it apart, there's brass components, there's steel spring that unwinds, there's gears in there that move the different hands at different rates. You realize that the hand is moving at approximately 1 second. You would never assume that this complex piece of machinery just showed up, that it evolved there from random mutations. You wouldn't assume that another watch had made it prior to that, right? So what's the difference between finding a watch in the forest and attributing some intelligent design behind it versus looking at the complexity of biological life and also the complexity of the cosmos and the order in which things happen? It's rational. How could you not look at that and say that there is an intelligent designer behind this purpose? So this conclusion of intelligent design is not weakened if we don't know how watches are made, right? So if we've never seen a watch before, we don't know how it makes, but we can tell that there's a purpose behind it. So it doesn't weaken our conclusion that someone designed it. What if it goes wrong sometimes? The purpose is still evident in the watch, even if it doesn't always work. And that's the thing, is who designed it for a purpose? That doesn't happen by random chance. What if it had extra parts? You ever hear that argument? Well, God didn't design, he didn't, what's the word I'm looking for? He didn't guide evolution, and he didn't create us because we have extra body parts in our body that have no purpose. What we're finding out is that's not true. Parts that we thought were not needed actually serve a purpose. But even if there were, that doesn't negate the purpose of the other parts. You see that? Of course, we wouldn't conclude it was assembled with a purpose by random chance. And of course, it's not enough to say that the watch was produced by a previous watch, which was produced by a previous watch, all into eternity past, because it still leaves the designer, it leaves the purpose unexplained. It doesn't explain that there was a designer behind it. There had to be some, even if DNA is all there is, as Richard Dawkins points out, DNA is information that drives extremely complex processes. Where did that information come from? And let's fast forward to today, some recent discoveries, and this teleological argument, this fine-tuning argument, has really just come roaring back in the popular world, if you will, in recent years, because what they're finding out is the explanatory adequacy of Darwinianism, meaning how well evolution explains how we got here, is built upon simple biological functions mutating and changing randomly into more complex until you get to higher level organisms like ourselves or any animal for that matter. But what they're finding in microbiology is this mind-boggling complexity of micro machines even within a single cell. Where did that come from? That was the basis for evolution, was that somehow, somewhere, there was a single cell that had life. That's unexplained, by the way. But it was simple and just involved in complexity. Well, we're finding out nowadays that it's not simple at all. And we don't even fully understand how complex it really is. But also what's really interesting is the fine-tuning or the purpose-driven aspects of the cosmos, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. And I'll give a few examples because in the video it goes by quickly and it's hard to really grasp it. So we'll give you kind of a preview right here, and then we'll watch the video here in a few seconds, a few minutes. So what do we mean by fine-tuning? This is important that we get definitions right. But it's really about addressing, I'm quoting William Lane Craig here, addressing the incomprehensible precision in which the universe is constructed to permit not only a life-supporting environment, but the existence of stars, planets, galaxies, and chemistry. In other words, the universe itself. So when we say fine-tuning, it's not about, hey, it's fine-tuned for life. There's fine-tuning involved just to even have a universe. It's not about life on Earth. It's not about life in general. There's just an extremely narrow window that the universe itself could even exist. We'll talk about that. The first, we'll give three examples here. The one, you guys are familiar with the law of gravity, right? That's what keeps us on the face of the earth. If we throw a ball up in the air, it falls back down. There's a term called a gravitational constant. And the force generated by gravity between two objects is the mass of each object multiplied by each other divided by the distance squared of how far apart they are. And then what scientists discovered is there's a constant that's multiplied by that value to get to a force. And that's called the gravitational constant. If that constant varied by 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, so that means a 1 with 60 zeros after it. That's how small of a fraction that if the gravitational constant varied, if it was too low, the universe would have expanded too quickly, so fast that stars couldn't form, much less planets or life. We're talking about the universe itself couldn't have formed. Or if it was 1 part in 10 to the 60th too high, the universe would have collapsed back on itself. And again, the same effect of no stars, no planets, no life. 10 to the 60th is really hard to understand. It's incomprehensible how big that number is, and therefore, when it's a denominator, how really small a window of precision is needed. But for reference, your body has about 10 to the 14th cells in it. So 1 followed by 14 zeros is how many cells your body has. And we're talking about if 1 in 10 to the 60th. So if imagine just one cell in your body that wasn't perfectly right, the universe would collapse on itself. It's even more precise than that. Some scientists believe that the universe is 13.4 billion, with a B, billion years old. You know how many seconds that is? It's about less than 10 to the 20th. We're talking about the gravitational constant. If it was off by 1 times 10 to the 60th of a fraction, the universe would not exist. And what's really neat about the gravitational constant is that the constant is independent of the laws. So the laws don't determine what the constant is. Let's talk about the other way, the expansion rate. We all know that the universe is expanding. That's where the standard model, or some people call it the Big Bang theory, that's where it came from. We can look and see the universe expanding. We'll talk about this on another night. The cosmological constant is essentially the rate, it determines the rate in which the universe is expanding. If it varied by 1 times 10 to the 120, 10 to the 120, so 1 followed by 120 zeros, if it was off by that little amount, again, the universe would have expanded so quickly that stars wouldn't exist, or the other direction, it would have collapsed back on itself. Yes, sir. There you go. Sure. And then a one, yeah, that's right. So, because we're talking about a fraction here, point 120 zeros, and then a 1. If that varied up to 2 or down to 0, 120 decimal points out to the right, everything we see would not exist. It's incomprehensible. And again, the cosmological constant is independent of the law. One of my favorite ones to think about, that the second law of thermodynamics shows that we're slowly running out of usable energy. The universe is. So we see, this is the reason we can't have perpetual motion machines, is because there's always some losses. There's always some imperfection in the way that energy is transferred to and forth to do work. So when you think about the Big Bang, and you think about how long we've existed since the Big Bang, if that is truly how the universe was formed, how is it still around for 13.4 billion years without having run out of energy yet? Well, there had to be what scientists call a special low entropy condition. Entropy is that measure of how inefficient things can be. But there had to be a very special condition as a boundary condition, a prerequisite to the Big Bang, that would allow for us to continue on as we have. Some people say it's a relationship between mass and energy, different types of energy, and that's, mass is energy, and it's really about how the energy is arranged, so that you can think about it like that. So again, let's think about it as a decimal. 10 raised to the 10th power raised to the 123rd power. If this special entropy condition at the beginning of the universe was, it's hard to imagine how many zeros that you can't. But if it varied just a little bit, again, the universe would not exist. Again, this isn't dependent upon the laws of nature. This is what really set the laws of nature depend on this. So it's not that it's derived from the universe. It set up the universe existing in the first place. So the question is, what's the best explanation for the universe? And Blake, if you want to get that video ready, the syllogism or the argument goes like this. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to physical necessity, chance, or design. And what that means is either designed, it was just random chance that we're here, or that it was necessarily, the universe is necessarily existing. In other words, it's impossible for it not to exist. Those are the only three options. Technically, based on how logic works, if you could come up with a fourth way and defend it, and it was more plausible than design, you could do that. But that covers, people really don't argue that point. That's not a point of argument. So premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise number 2 is it is not due to physical necessity or chance. So the whole argument hinges on premise number 2, that you have to show that it's more plausible that it was designed than exist necessarily, or that is random chance that we're here. And then through our study, we'll show that it is that it's not due to physical necessity or chance, so therefore it is due to design. So Blake, let's pause the recording and then watch. Let's watch this video.